The beast yawned into the winter dawn. He wasn't any stranger to seeing clouds billow from his mouth, but there was an odd, relaxing satisfaction to it being something other than smoke. Feldspar wasn't like most other dragons. He was laid back, kind, and completely uninterested in the antics of humans. He didn't care about what humans did around him, or what other dragons thought of him. He was comfortable in his cave. He had all the food he could ask for. He didn't care for treasure. He had everything he could ever want. So why was he feeling so down? Feldspar scraped his claw against the boulder beside the cave entrance, something he usually did when something upset him. That morning, however, he couldn't identify what exactly was troubling him, which only upset him more, resulting in yet more scratch marks on the stone. He yawned again. Maybe he was just tired and cranky. Dragons his age usually weren't, but he didn't get out much. He shuffled deeper into the cave and curled around himself, hugging his tail for the added comfort. When he woke up again, he heard the sounds of something in the underbrush just past the entrance to his cave. He lifted his head, hiding it in the cave's shadow to not startle whatever it was. A small pack of goblins emerged from the bushes, brandishing knives and gibbering something in their froggish language. They all crept up to the entrance of Feldspar's cave, some carrying what looked like crude bundles of supplies. Feldspar wasn't about to let a bunch of goblins set up camp in his home. He let out as menacing a deep growl as he could manage. The toad-footed goblins seemed to take notice and started glancing around, their yellow eyes gleaming as the sunlight shone against them. That didn't scare them off, so Feldspar took in a deep breath and roared as best he could. The noise was brief, but loud enough to get the message across to the green invaders. The goblins shrieked when they saw him lumber out of the cave's shadow. Even though he wasn't the most fit or imposing dragon, they still turned and ran. Then again, they're goblins. An elk could have probably scared them off just as easily. Feldspar watched the goblins run away, croakily screaming as half of them dropped what crude weapons they carried. The dragon shook his head and swatted the flint knives and hatchets away with his tail. He returned to the cave to rest again. Surely those goblins would warn others of the fierce dragon who lived in a cave within these woods. He smirked at the thought. No goblin in its right mind would ever go near his home again. When that bit of excitement was over, Feldspar slumped down to rest again, but that feeling of sorrow returned. He unconsciously scraped the stone floor of his cave, his pointed claws wearing dull against the rock. He clawed at his hide. No scales fell off. He wasn't shedding. He scratched his horns against the wall. Clean scratches marked where he made contact. They weren't overgrowing. He spat fire against the back wall. Pathetic as always, but it came out as smooth as normal, so nothing was wrong there. Whatever was bothering him, it had nothing to do with his health. Was he lonely? Nah, that couldn't be it. He's been alone since he arrived there 20 years earlier. He never needed anyone, and he still didn't. Right? Feldspar shook his head to clear his mind. Trying to ignore the strange, lonely feeling only made it eat at his mind more. He couldn't get comfortable for the rest of the day. No other thoughts would distract him. He tried everything he could think of to ignore it. His mind wandered more. He thought about the old tales of dragons who would abduct a princess. Was this why they did it? They just wanted a companion? But why a princess specifically? Feldspar shook his head again. If he was going to get a companion, he wouldn't kidnap someone for it, especially not a princess. He was laid back and pathetic, but he wasn't a fool. Maybe a simple animal would be willing to share his dwelling place, or one of the kinder monsters of the forest. Oh, who was he kidding? Feldspar was a dragon. What creature would willingly stay with him? He slumped at the cave entrance, his head landed out in the open to rest in the grass. The realization that he was doomed to be alone left a hole somewhere in him. Whether it was in his heart or his soul, he couldn't identify. Probably both. A flake of snow danced on his snout. He looked up to see more fluttering down from above. It had been a while since it snowed that winter. Seeing the white blanket across the landscape always brought a smile to Feldspar's face, even though he didn't care much for the cold. Maybe that would distract him from his loneliness. He stood up and lumbered out of the cave. His footsteps echoed between the trees as he moved, most likely scaring off the local wildlife. He didn't care. He just wanted to see the snow. The trees parted before him to provide a view of an open field of grass. Patches of white had already gathered in places, and he couldn't wait to see the landscapes of winter build themselves before him. Feldspar lumbered into the fields and sat down on the side of a hill. He looked around as the snow fell, seeing if he could identify the patterns in each individual flake. Maybe he'd find two that were alike. Hours passed, but they feel like minutes. The hypnotic dance of snow in the air distracted the dragon from his woes, but it wouldn't last. The last snowflakes landed, leaving him sitting on the hill, half covered in snow himself. He lowered his head, disappointed that it was over. He shook off the snow that gathered on him and turned to leave. Once he faced the forest again, he saw a small group of humans had gathered to look at him. He averted his gaze, embarrassed that he'd somehow attracted a crowd by sitting out there. He didn't know what to do. Stay and wait for them to leave? Try to sneak away? Just run past them to get home quickly and hide? In a panic, he slumped down, laying his head in the snow, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. He didn't want to ignite any problems. He didn't want to terrify anyone. He just wanted to live his life and maybe find someone to share it with. He peeked over the snowy clump of grass to see if the people left. The group sped up, urging each other forward with words and friendly nudges. Feldspar laid in the snow, watching them disappear until he heard new footsteps crunching on the icy path. The bundled-up figure paused. With a frown, she stared longingly after the distant group. She sighed and shook her head before turning to adjust her pack. Suddenly, her head whipped up, and her gaze met Feldspar's. That's the last thing Feldspar wanted. Someone to approach him. He wanted to shuffle away. To just run and get out of there. But he felt frozen in place as the woman stared. Humans were ultimately no different than any woodland creature in the face of something larger than themselves. The woman stepped nearer. Feldspar shuffled away, keeping an eye on her as she got too close for comfort. If she got any closer than that. The woman slipped on a patch of ice, startling Feldspar enough for him to leap backward. He ran in a wide curve, hoping to disappear into a denser patch of forest. He crashed through the trees, doing his best to not knock any over as he navigated back to his cave. He dived in and retreated to the deepest crevice. Humans were the one thing that a dragon should be scared of, if anything. They had armor and weapons that could pierce a dragon's hide with little effort. He returned to the entrance of his cave and dragged the boulder to block himself in and anyone else out. His fear of loneliness had been greatly outweighed by a fear of company. He had no idea what to say or do, so he ran away like always. The next morning, Feldspar pushed the boulder away and stepped outside in the bright morning. On a flat stone nearby, he spotted a chunk of dried sausage and half an apple laid out on a plain cloth. He approached slowly, looking around to see if anyone lingered nearby. There was no one. Only footprints showed that anyone had come near. Then, as he walked over to the gift, he saw some words scratched into the snow. "I understand.